Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we'll be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
We're recording this just a few days before the local elections in England and the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Parliament, or Senedd elections, in Scotland and Wales. These are going to be dramatic. I think we would all agree on that, even before the event itself. And quite possibly, the future of Keir Starmer's leadership and his time as Prime Minister could depend upon what happens at the polls in just a few days' time. It's easy for us to think that our politics today is uniquely volatile compared to the much more stable two-party politics of the past. That is certainly a reflection, I think, may be drawn in the days ahead. It's also easy for us to think that our current and recent governments are uniquely unpopular. If you think about the fag-end years of the last Conservative government or this Labour government under Keir Starmer, their polling is appalling. And it can be quite tempting to think that might be novel compared to the better politics of the past. But I think the local elections of 1968 really challenged both of those ideas. Unlike today, it is basically two-party politics. Depending on which bit of the United Kingdom you're in now, we're either a five-party or a seven-party country, or so it seems, looking at some of the opinion polls. But back in 1968, it very much was all about the two parties. But much like today, there's a very unpopular Labour Prime Minister, at risk of challenge to his leadership, and the local elections prove a bloodbath for the Labour Party. So what happened then? How bad were the results, and what were the consequences for Harold Wilson and his leadership of the Labour Party and his time in number 10 Downing Street? That's the subject of this week's episode. Richard, to kick us off, let's think about Harold Wilson. Having benefited, as I did, from an education at Wirral Grammar School for Boys, he becomes Prime Minister in 1964, and in 1966 wins a landslide victory at the polls when he's up against Ted Heath, the new Conservative leader, for the first time. He had very much been on the up in the mid-1960s, and he had the sort of majority by 1968 that he could do pretty much whatever you want with. So what was he doing with it? And what difficulties was he facing in governing?
Well, that period, particularly the year 1967 into 1968, was one of the worst times in Harold Wilson's leadership of the Labour Party and his premierships. The country was facing some very serious economic difficulties. In the autumn of 1967, there was the sterling crisis over the value of the pound. Now, this is the time of, many listeners I'm sure will be familiar with this, the time of the Bretton Woods system, where there were fixed exchange rates between major national currencies, and the dollar was convertible with gold. And there was a view from currency speculators that the British pound was too highly valued. And so what that meant is that they were exchanging pounds for dollars and then exchanging dollars for gold and trying to make a profit, basically, from doing that. And in order for the Treasury to stop this massive speculation, they eventually had to devalue. This was, in my view, a perfectly sensible thing for the government to do, but there was a lot of pride about the value of the pound. There was also the memory that it was the Attlee government that had previously devalued the pound, and Wilson and his Chancellor Jim Callaghan didn't want to do that, but in the end, Callaghan had no other option, and he was moved out of the Treasury as a result of that and swapped with the Home Secretary Roy Jenkins, and Roy Jenkins becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer. A few months later, in March of 1968, so we're getting closer now to the local elections, the problems of currency have not gone away, and these speculators, awful people, whoever they were now trying to make money off of the dollar and its convertibility with gold. And a lot of foreign currencies had put their gold reserves in what was called the London Gold Pool. And the Americans were worried that they were now going to see this huge outflow of dollars in exchange for gold that would become unsustainable. And so on the evening of Thursday, the 14th of March, 1968, Number 10 gets a phone call from Washington saying, close down the London gold pool, stop this from happening. And so the solution to this is to call an unusual Friday bank holiday the following day. And in order for that to happen, the Prime Minister had to get the Queen to declare that there would be a Friday bank holiday within a matter of hours before the banks actually were due to open. And so this was done as an order in council with her Privy Councillors. Three's a crowd with the Privy Council. And so the Prime Minister took the Chancellor, Roy Jenkins, his head of the Department of Economic Affairs, Peter Shaw, and three of them went to the palace in the middle of the night to see the Queen. I don't know if she was in her slippers or negligee or whatever. But anyway, it was a very late night meeting. This proved to be quite consequential for the internal politics of the Labour cabinet because Wilson had not brought along with him the deputy leader of the Labour Party and the Foreign Secretary, who was the same person, George Brown. And when Brown found out about this, he was absolutely enraged. He, in fact, immediately issued his resignation from the cabinet over this snub. Now, some people might know George Brown was known to be partial to a drink. And I think Wilson's reasoning for not taking George Brown to the palace at midnight that Thursday was partly because he expected George Brown to be a few pints in or a few glasses in by that point. I think there's some evidence to support that in the fact that Barbara Castle records in her diaries that night when they were going through the voting lobbies a few hours earlier that George Brown, who was stood behind her in the voting lobbies, unbuttoned the back of her blouse. And she then turned around and said, George just stood there grinning like a schoolboy. So I think he was a little bit probably not in the greatest state of mind to see the Queen. But anyway, what that then, of course, meant was not only did you have this currency crisis that had been ongoing, there was this sort of state of panic that seemed to be setting in the markets and so on, but the Prime Minister, in the course of less than 6 months, had lost his Chancellor and his Foreign Secretary. And George Brown actually didn't resign as deputy leader. He, in fact, continued sitting as the deputy leader, but from the back benches, and would stay in that position until he lost his seat in the 1970 election. That, I think, gives you a sort of sense of the sort of economic crisis that the government is facing, but also a certain sense of a political crisis. Wilson had to reshuffle his cabinets as these events happened. Reshuffles are always fraught with danger because some people feel that they should have been moved to a better place, or some people get moved to a less good place. Wilson sacked his education secretary, Patrick Gordon Walker, who we've done an episode on for this podcast in the past. Gordon Walker was sort of the arch Gateskill figure of the right of the Labour Party in the cabinet, and he was very incensed by the fact that Wilson had sacked him from the cabinet, and that will come back a bit later on to bite Wilson.
And those political and economic crises were beginning to have electoral consequences. So in the lead up to the 1968 local elections, there are a whole series of by-elections which are catastrophic for Harold Wilson and for Labour. There's one in the November of 1967, 2nd of November, in Leicester South West. That's a by-election which, well, it's not too unreasonable really for a mid-term government, but a 5,500 Labour majority turns into an almost 4,000 Conservative majority, with Labour's vote down by almost 23%. But the bit that's really catastrophic is the 28th of March 1968, when there are three by-elections all on the same day, and they're all Labour defences. One of them is in Meriden, which Labour had won by 4,500 in 1966. That is flipped Conservative, with a 15,000 Conservative majority. In Dudley, where George Whig has been made a member of the House of Lords. George Whig has appeared occasionally in this podcast. He's one of those eccentric figures of 1950s and 60s Labour politics. A 10,000 Labour majority is turned into an 11,500 Conservative majority. That's in Dudley. And in Acton, in West London, a seat which had been won by Labour by almost 5,000. Kenneth Baker, the future Education Minister in Margaret Thatcher's government, among other things, he wins it with a majority of almost 4,000. So in the lead-up to the May local elections, when Labour was meeting the voters at the polls, all of those things that you've discussed, the chaos in the currency markets, the political tumult at the top of the cabinet, including with George Brown who was a pretty difficult figure to manage on his best or his worst behaviour. It doesn't really matter which he's on. He's a pretty difficult political figure to manage, I would have thought. Voters are noticing, and they're taking it out on Labour when they get the chance.
Yes, so those by-elections happened just 2 weeks after this evening at the palace. But as you say, actually, the government had been experiencing very bad by-election defeats long before then. In September 1967, there'd been a by-election in Cambridge, which I wrote about in a book that I co-authored called Camaraderie, 100 Years to the Cambridge Labour Party. And I interviewed some people who were involved in that 1967 by-election campaign for the book. And they remembered it quite fondly because although it was quite formed out of tragic circumstances, the Labour MP for Cambridge, who was elected in 1966 in the landslide, the first Labour MP Cambridge had elected since 1945, died a year into the job from an undiagnosed heart condition. He was, and this I always think is quite funny for Cambridge, he was an ardent Eurosceptic left-wing Labour MP, back in the days when the Labour Party understood that to be on the left was to be Eurosceptic. But the reason I say that a lot of people remember it quite fondly is because loads of Labour luminaries came up to Cambridge to campaign in that by-election. You had the likes of Barbara Castle, you had the likes of Tony Benn, and they just sort of remember this sort of sense of all these kind of Labour celebrities coming up to Cambridge. That turned out to be a great error because on the very same day as that by-election, there was a by-election in Walthamstow, which had been Clement Attlee's seat in his final term as an MP. And Labour assumed that Walthamstow would be so safe that basically they wouldn't need to put much effort into it. And on the night of the by-election, Labour lost both Cambridge and Walthamstow, which goes to show you sort of the scale of the problems that Labour was facing. And I should also say, connected to this situation with the currency is this policy the government had of prices and incomes, where the government, to maintain control on inflation, was limiting the rate at which workers could bargain for higher wages. And the trade-off for that was also to impose price controls on basic necessities and goods. And there are winners and losers, obviously, to both policies. The workers didn't like the fact they couldn't bargain for higher wages, and businesses didn't like the fact that they couldn't make more profit or they were constrained in the prices they could set for their goods. So the government was facing some general, very unfavourable background economic conditions that some people saw were partly the government's own making.
But let's make our way closer to local election polling day. And in the short campaign, in the lead up to people going to the polls, one of the most famous speeches in British politics is made. Famous and infamous. And that is Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. So this is a speech that he gives to a meeting of the Conservative Political Centre, which was basically the political education group within the Conservative Party at the time. And he gives the speech in Birmingham. He is himself a West Midlands MP, and Birmingham has elections coming up at the time. I think most listeners to this podcast will be familiar with it, but the speech is one of the most inflammatory speeches that's been made, certainly by any mainstream politician. And he was at the time a member of the Conservative Shadow Cabinet. He was part of mainstream British politics. He'd been a minister under Macmillan. But it is one of the most inflammatory speeches any mainstream political figure has given in this country. Among other things, he makes a vitriolic attack on immigration coming into the UK and says that within 15 or 20 years, quote, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. We don't have time in this podcast to do justice, really, to all of the debate and the fallout of that speech and the short-term or the long-term consequences of it, except to say that there were lots of people who were incredibly angry about what Enoch Powell had said. They included a great many Conservative MPs, not least Edward Heath, the party leader, but also lots of senior members of the Shadow Cabinet who demanded that Enoch Powell was sacked, which he duly was. But there were also people who agreed with what Enoch Powell had said. And there were famously protests in which people would hold banners saying that they agreed with Enoch and that he was right in what he said about immigration. So this nuclear bomb of a speech goes off in the lead up to these local elections. And it's not entirely obvious, I think, on first impressions, what impact it's going to have. In one sense, there will be, I think, people who agree with Powell, who would be motivated to go out to the polls and to register their agreement with him. On the other hand, there'll be people who strongly disagree with Powell, who may therefore be motivated to do the opposite. It's also a difficult issue for the Conservatives because Powell has been sacked immediately after giving this speech, in the sense that if you agree with Powell, it's the thing to do to vote for his party and give a boost to the leader who has let him go for making these remarks. So I think if we try and put ourselves into the mindset of those days after the Rivers of Blood speech, and what would its particular impact be on these 1968 local elections, I think it's really quite unpredictable.
Well, I think it's important to say the background context to this, and one of the reasons why Powell gave the speech in the first place was that the Labour government was putting forward a bill through Parliament at the time called the Race Relations Bill, which would be one of the sort of first major, I think really the first major race equality bill in Britain. And it was to outlaw certain forms of discriminatory racial behaviour and also to set up the Race Relations Board, which became the Equality and Human Rights Commission, a quango that monitors accounts of racial discrimination in the workplace, in housing, in day-to-day life. And this bill obviously was seen by some on the right as a step too far, very inflammatory, and they responded with their inflammatory rhetoric. So 2 days after Powell gives his Rivers of Blood speech, the Race Relations Bill is going through its second reading in the House of Commons. And on that day, there is a demonstration through London of 1,000 dockers from London who are opposed to the Race Relations Bill. And that in itself is quite poignant and symbolic because, of course, dockers had been such a major part of the history of the Labour movement. In some respects, we could look to, for example, the dockers' strikes of the late 19th and early 20th century, such as the 1889 dockers' strike, as some of the foundational moments in the creation of what became the Labour Party. And yet, Wilson had already had lots of problems with dockers. There'd been a dockers' strike the year before, which some had argued had contributed to the inflation that the government was then trying to battle. So relations were very poor. But that sort of hit home this kind of sense that the government was angering an element of its historic working class base over the issue of immigration and what at the time was called race relations or race equality legislation.
These are unavoidably broad brush terms, but if we consider that to be Wilson's challenge on the right, I want to come on to Wilson's challenge on the left, because this is, I think, a comparison with today, which to some degree may be analogous. If we think first of all about the 2026 context, the Green Party in particular today is running on a platform markedly to the left of Labour in many respects, and they are expecting next week to do very well, especially in the London local elections and in some of the more central and East London boroughs. There'll be other pockets around the country, I'm sure, where they will have a very good night. Thinking back to 1968, the left didn't have somewhere else to go, in the sense that this is not a massively splintered political landscape. It is overwhelmingly a two-party political system. But to what extent were they disgruntled with Wilson anyway? Perhaps to the point of abstention in the polls, of not being willing to turn out and vote Labour in this context. So if Powell and the Tories represented the problem for Wilson's right flank, how did things look to his left?
Well, it didn't look good at all. I've already talked about some of the anger against the government from the perspective of the trade unions over the wages policies, inhibiting their ability to bargain for higher wages for their members, and how members of the working class felt aggrieved by that. You also had, from, say, maybe the more middle class or intellectual left, lots of criticisms against the government's foreign policy. So there was a huge controversy on the Labour left over selling arms to South Africa. Again, not to try and draw too many trite comparisons, but of course, this Labour government's faced criticism for selling arms to Israel. And the argument of the left in the 1960s was the government should not be selling arms to an apartheid state. And the Wilson government basically tried to fudge this and say, we will not sell South Africa any arms that can be used to oppress South Africans, but we will sell them arms that can be used for the self-defense of South Africa. Understanding something of the geopolitics of this, but also understanding something of the economics behind this, that these were important contracts for the government from the perspective of employment in the defense industries. So that didn't make the Labour left very happy. The Labour left was also very unhappy about the government's position on the Vietnam War. And I think this is worth just mentioning because a lot of people recently have drawn, again, somewhat lazy comparisons between Keir Starmer and Harold Wilson over Iran and Vietnam, and Wilson kept us out of Vietnam and Starmer's kept us out of Iran, etc., etc. And of course, there is some comparison to be made there. I'm not against making these comparisons. I make them all the time. But the Labour left were actually quite angry with Wilson's position on Vietnam because they believed that the British government should not just be out of the Vietnam War, but should be ending the Vietnam War, and that Britain should use its influence and power on the world stage to pressure the Americans to bring an end to the Vietnam War, whereas Wilson's approach basically was let the Americans get on with it, it's not our war, and we're not sending anyone to get into it, but it's not for us to tell the Americans which war to fight, whereas the left said it is your job to put pressure on the Americans to get them to stop the war because it's an immoral war.
Let's come on to the local election results themselves. And I think a good place to start is with London, because just like in 2026, all of London is having council elections in 1968. So London is made up of 32 borough councils, which we still have today, as it happens. And they came into effect in 1965. They were elected for the first time for the sort of shadow year in 64. And that's a highly consequential year, both in the story of Harold Wilson, but also in post-war British politics more generally, as it's the first major electoral test for the new Conservative leader and Prime Minister, Alec Douglas-Home, and it's the last set of local elections before the general election that year, which took place in October. That's the election where Wilson comes to power. And in 1964, these inaugural London Borough Council elections, Labour wins 20 councils to 9 for the Conservatives, and Labour wins 1,112 of the councillors, compared to 668 for the Conservatives. So more than double the number of councils under Labour control, and not quite, but getting on to double the number of councillors elected for Labour. A quick little aside about that, really, from 1964. For all of the ways in which politics has changed, it's amazing sometimes what's really striking about how it hasn't changed. So if you look back to those 1964 local elections, the 9 councils that the Conservatives won were Barnet, Bromley, Harrow, Kensington and Chelsea, Kingston upon Thames, Redbridge, Richmond upon Thames, and Westminster. Mostly still the more Tory inclined, although now Richmond and Kingston have gone pretty solidly Lib Dem, but have been Conservative in recent years. And many of those places still, like Westminster, for example, are going to be the battleground elections coming up at the moment. So it's really quite striking how similar some parts of the political map, at least, look, even though we're now more than 6 decades on. I mean, of those places that the Conservatives won, really Redbridge in London is probably the only one that is no longer really in play for the Conservatives at all compared to the others. But anyway, so that's the background going into the 1968 local elections. Really quite an emphatic Labour win in 64. So Richard, what happens 4 years later?
Well, the results in London in 1968 were devastating for Labour. Labour lost control of every council except for 3 councils, Southwark, Tower Hamlets and Barking. From having over 1,000 councillors, as you mentioned, Lee, in the 1964 council elections, Labour went down to just 350. It's almost a loss of 3/4 of its council seats, getting on for that, in London. In some boroughs, Labour is wiped out entirely. In other boroughs, it's nearly wiped out. In Lambeth, for example, Labour lost 57 out of the 60 seats there. These were the worst local election results for Labour since the Labour government was in charge of the country during the Great Depression.
One of the ones that stood out to me as being most striking is Islington, where there were 60 seats on Islington Borough Council. And in 1964, Labour had a clean sweep. They won every seat in the borough. Then in 1968, the Conservatives went from 0 councillors to 47, a massive majority, as Labour was reduced to 10 and 3 independents were elected. I mean, this is a sort of political volatility that isn't just a massive rebuke for one particular party, in this case the incumbent government and Harold Wilson as Prime Minister, but which also then throws up some pretty big challenges actually locally. So in that case, you've got 47 new Conservative councillors forming the administration, none of whom have any experience of running Islington Borough Council, because for the only 4 years it exists, there's not been a single Tory on it. And it's quite an interesting comparison to draw that we'll see play out in the years ahead. If the upcoming local elections in places like London are similarly volatile and a similar scale of rebuke for Keir Starmer's Labour Party, you could quite possibly, again, lose on the one hand a lot of historic knowledge of the previous councillor base and have it replaced with people who are totally fresh, which of course will have positives and negatives. So that's London. I mean, bloodbath for Wilson and the Labour Party. But it wasn't just a phenomenon in London. I mean, this was happening all over the country at the time. In many ways, the London results are more dramatic because they are all-out elections. Every councillor was up for election there. In lots of places, only a third of them were. But once you dig into other parts of the map, you begin to see similarly dramatic results. I mean, to demonstrate that, I picked out 3 northern cities which were up for election. In Sheffield, where 30 of their councillors were up, the Conservatives won 22 of them, gaining 8 seats and taking control of the council for the first time since 1930s. In Manchester, where 41 of their 152 seats were up, the Conservatives made 11 gains to end up with 91 seats on the council, having won 62% of the vote in Manchester. So a huge number of Conservative gains. And one of the ones that is perhaps the nearest to being a little like London is Leeds, because Leeds has gone through major boundary changes, so they have to have a general election rather than just a partial election. And in the good Tory city of Leeds, at least in 1968, the Conservatives win 75 of the councillors, with Labour down to 12 and the Liberals on 3. So all over the country, there were these major victories for the Conservatives.
Yes, and so actually going back a little bit, Scotland, being Scotland and doing things slightly differently, actually voted earlier in the week. And so already you could see that the tide was going to be turning against Labour in a dramatic way. So Labour loses control of Glasgow, and the SNP come first in Glasgow, which is a significant step in the rise of the SNP in Scotland. And in Edinburgh, Labour comes third. Its vote share in Edinburgh is half of what it had just been in Edinburgh 2 years earlier. So already politicians could see that the results were going to be bad. Barbara Castle writes in her diaries the day after the local elections that the results in England were far worse than anyone had contemplated. And she writes, the whole country seems to have gone berserk. In the Midlands, the scale of Labour's defeat was appalling. The Conservatives won every seat in Leicester. Labour lost every seat in Birmingham. That may be worth tying in with our reflections on Enoch Powell. Of course, he gives the Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham the month before the local elections, and he himself was a Midlands MP. He represented Wolverhampton. And perhaps the saddest of the casualties of the local elections in 1968 was my dear grandfather, who lost his seat in Hemel Hempstead, although I think he was back on the council a year later, so it was just a temporary reprieve.
If the Labour spin doctors want to try and find good comparisons for whatever happens to Labour in 2026, I rather feel like they could draw comfort from what happens in 1968. Birmingham, for example, is up for election this year, and it's very difficult to imagine, although time will tell, that Labour will lose every seat in Birmingham, as it did then. So really, the scale of these results is very hard to exaggerate just quite how bad these were for Wilson. Richard, when you wrote quite recently for The New Statesman, you began your piece, "The country is facing, quote, a Prime Minister with little support in the country. the press, or the government. He survives only because of the inertia of his party and the lack of a mechanism for getting rid of him." End quote. Those words could easily describe Keir Starmer. In fact, they were written about Harold Wilson's position after Labour's catastrophic local election defeats in May 1968. That's the opening paragraph of your article. So how intense was this backlash against Wilson following these poor results?
There was intense speculation about Wilson's future as leader of the Labour Party. And in the weeks and months before the local elections, there had been a growing, almost conventional wisdom that if the local election results were as bad as everyone thought, then Harold Wilson would be out of Downing Street. We've talked about all the kind of political difficulties and economic difficulties that Wilson was facing, but there was also a general sense that Wilson had been elected with a bold mandate to change the country, and he had not delivered on that mandate. He had, in fact, been very reactive to the economic and international situation rather than proactive. He was also seen as a man who couldn't be trusted, that he was a liar. Private Eye, which was never a great friend of Harold Wilson, and he was never their great friend, had a character who was basically Harold Wilson. And in 1968, they described this Harold Wilson character as follows: posing variously as an economist, a socialist, a pragmatist, and a statesman, he has conned and conned again until the public have ceased to care. Never before has such a gigantic hoax been perpetuated by such a small man. To call this man a liar is to flatter him. So I have great regard for Harold Wilson. I think he was a great Labour leader and Prime Minister. But if you were only to know Harold Wilson in these previous 6 months leading up to the local elections, you would have thought that he was dead man walking. And in many respects, I think Wilson thought that he was dead man walking as well.
But of course, for the most part, leaderships don't just self-combust. There has to be a trigger, to mix the metaphors, that brings them down. And then, as now, there are basically two ways to remove a Labour Prime Minister. Now, this is a more general point, in fact. There are two ways to generally remove Prime Ministers, either by intolerable pressure or via the rule books of the respective parties. So intolerable pressure may be mass public calls for them to go from senior players within the party, most likely cabinet resignation, some form of putsch at the top. What in the Tory party is sometimes described as the men in grey suits walking in to say, look, the time is up. There's basically no real example of that ever happening in the Tory party as it happens, but that's the iconic idea, the metaphor that lingers on. The alternative would be to do it by the rules. And then, as now, the Labour Party had rules about how the leader could change, which applied even when they were in government. But my understanding is that the rules at the time only permitted annual elections, which could come at the annual meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party in the autumn. So basically, if Wilson was to go in the aftermath of these results in May of 1968, it would most probably need his MPs, and most probably of all cabinet ministers, to decide to move against him. That'd be my understanding of it. Is that your view?
Yes, so Labour, from the foundation of the Parliamentary Labour Party in 1906 until the party unwisely changed its rules in 1981, had annual elections for leader. And anyone could stand for leader as long as they had a proposer and a seconder. Although that sounds like that is a recipe for chaos, it actually led to really very substantial stability in Labour leaderships. Leaders were very rarely challenged. Harold Wilson did more challenging than most. He challenged both Hugh Gaitskell and George Brown for the leadership and deputy leadership, respectively, in the early 1960s. But of course, local elections were a good 6 or 7 months before the next time that this meeting would occur. And so, as you say, you basically had to force the incumbent to resign. And so there was an effort from backbench Labour MPs to demonstrate that there was support for a new leader. This effort was being led by Patrick Gordon Walker, who I mentioned earlier. Just a month before the local elections, Harold Wilson had sacked from the cabinet as Education Secretary. Gordon Walker is now on the backbenches. He consults with backbench Labour MPs as to whether or not they think Wilson should go. And Patrick Gordon Walker alleged that he had a list of 120 Labour MPs who, if a senior Labour figure would step forward to replace Wilson, they would be prepared to show their support for that individual. Patrick Gordon Walker claimed that he even had the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party who was behind this. But unlike now, where actually that would really mean something, because 20% of MPs, or about 80, based on the numbers of Labour MPs who are there today, can nominate a candidate to challenge an incumbent. No such mechanism existed at that time. So these names were purely symbolic, but they were there to apply political pressure, basically both on Wilson, but also on a member of the cabinet to go after Wilson.
In an echo down the ages, that question of who in the cabinet is willing to make a move, who is ambitious enough to want the leadership themselves, and then who is courageous enough to try and grab the crown off the Prime Minister's head and plant it on their own. That question's very often put. It has been in recent weeks and months about Keir Starmer's leadership, but it's very often been put about threats to an incumbent leader. So who was thinking of moving against Wilson? And the spoiler alert really is to say, why didn't they?
So this was the big problem. Who was actually going to be the one to take down Wilson? Who was going to be the one to make the first move and to call for him to resign, or to resign from the cabinet and hopefully lead this charge against Wilson such that it would be intolerable for Wilson to stay on as Prime Minister? The backbench Labour MPs apparently had speculated endlessly on this. Bill Rogers, who's still with us, who was one of these right-wing Labour MPs, said it was sort of constant conversation that they had with each other for weeks and weeks. Who's going to be the one to bring down Wilson? David Owen, who's also still with us, another one of these right-wing Labour MPs, he was elected just in the 1966 election for the first time. Never a man lacking confidence, wrote just at the time of the local elections in a letter to his then girlfriend, with a little luck, we might be able to oust the Prime Minister in about June. So they sort of saw June as the timeline. Well, in that period, you start to think about, well, who could go against Wilson? George Brown, who'd been a candidate for the leadership before and had been the leading figure of the right of the Labour Party, he was, of course, still the deputy leader from the backbenches. Brown couldn't move against Wilson in the sense he couldn't resign from cabinet because he'd already resigned. So he was already damaged in that respect. Jim Callaghan, who was seen as the other sort of main figure of the trade union right of the party, both Brown and Callaghan, it's worth saying, were both working class members of the cabinet. But Callaghan had been damaged by devaluation. So it wasn't his moment either. Tony Benn wrote in his diaries that Wilson, quote, just lives in fear of the day when 4 senior ministers will come to him and say that they won't serve under his leadership. But you've already taken out 2 of the most plausible candidates against him. Other members of the cabinet, Tony Crosland, Dennis Healey, they're seen as a little bit too junior to stand at that point. Other people like Michael Foot have remained on the backbenches, have never served in the cabinet. Dick Crossman, who was seen as a successful housing minister at the start of the Labour government, was seen as too prickly and too erudite, I suppose, in a way, to be leader. Some people even wrote about maybe Barbara Castle standing for the leadership, although Dick Crossman quickly dismissed her on the basis that she was a woman. Some things never change in the Labour Party. And so really the last plausible candidate standing was the Chancellor, Roy Jenkins. And it became increasingly clear that Jenkins was really the only viable candidate who could have the seniority to move first, to bring down Wilson, and also command the support of most Labour MPs. And Wilson knew this. Wilson knew that Jenkins was his rival. And so at one of the cabinet meetings in the aftermath of the local elections, Wilson launches a broadside where he says to his cabinet, "I know that someone around this table is wanting to sit in my place." But then he warns them that, quote, "Life will be as intolerable for him as it is for me. In other words, careful what you wish for, mate, because actually being Prime Minister isn't as fun as people make out." And that might have meant something for Roy Jenkins, a man who was described by one of his biographers as a man who liked to live a well-rounded life. And perhaps there would have been something in the back of Jenkins's mind about, do I really want to run Britain at this particularly perilous time? It's not going to be much fun. It's going to be very stressful. Jenkins and Wilson meet together privately. Wilson raises the matter of the leadership for the first time, explicitly with Jenkins. And he says to Jenkins something like, "Don't worry, Roy, I'm not going to stay on leader for too long." That gives Jenkins a sense that maybe Wilson will retire in the autumn, and then there will be a normal process of replacing the leader later in the year. And that seems a slightly better prospect for Jenkins than being the one to wield the knife against Wilson. Funnily enough, Jenkins writes that after Wilson makes this promise that he won't stay on as leader too long, Wilson then immediately changes the topic of the conversation to Victorian railways and the engineering prowess of the Victorians. And then Jenkins says they spent 20 minutes talking about different railway tracks and things like that from the Victorian era. Jenkins tells his friend and sometimes rival Denis Healey, quote, "I will never be caught with a dagger in my hand unless it is already smoking with my enemy's blood." Bit of a mixed metaphor there, I think. But the point here is that, and Jenkins himself later reflects on this, he could have brought down Harold Wilson. He's very confident about that. He could have announced that he was resigning as Chancellor, and he had lost confidence in the Prime Minister, and that he needed the Prime Minister to announce his resignation, and that there should be an open Labour leadership contest in which Jenkins would stand and replace Wilson. And I think that's probably right. I think Jenkins could have done it, but he lost his nerve, allowed Wilson to basically trick him into waiting, and rather than wait 8 more months for a Labour leadership contest, Jenkins had to wait 8 more years.
Yes, that is the good news for Wilson, that not only does he survive, he leads Labour back to a position where he calls the election in 1970, expecting to win. Wilson and Labour don't win that election, as it happens, but the defeat is relatively narrow, at least compared to what you might expect from the 1968 local election results. And then, of course, in 1974, Wilson just about wins the twin elections of that year, in seats anyway, and is still Prime Minister 8 years later, when he leaves of his own accord, and is seen really as being the first Prime Minister since Stanley Baldwin, you could argue, or perhaps certainly the Marquis of Salisbury, to leave office when he wants, rather than when his party, the electorate, or an act of God chooses for him to go. There are lots of comparisons that listeners will draw themselves between then and now, including about what does it mean to have only one person who can realistically take over from the Prime Minister in 1968, and how does that compare to now, where certainly there is more than one person who would like to be sitting in Keir Starmer's seat. Similarly, there are comparisons people will think about in terms of, yes, there are people who won't want the job themselves, who won't think they're in the running for the job, but to what extent would they contribute towards being, as Tony Benn put it, one of the 4 or so senior ministers who could walk into 10 Downing Street and basically end the Premiership if they withdrew their support and refused to serve under the Prime Minister. So there's lessons, I think, there for Labour about how the next few months, if Starmer is to be challenged or not, may unfold, and also hints at a strategy for survival, but also a strategy for defenestrating the current Prime Minister.
I think the key difference now is that just 1 in 5 Labour MPs can actually force a contest, whereas before that you had to rely on these cabinet ministers. Cabinet ministers, of course, have more to lose when they call for the leader to go, because, and this was, I think, basically Roy Jenkins's view, if you're going to go for the prime minister, you better not miss, because if you do, then you're out. And Jenkins was quite happy being Chancellor. He felt that he'd had a successful budget. There were a lot of people on the right who didn't like the budget because it put up taxes. The tax rate was very high. The basic rate of tax was over 40%. Unearned income, passive income could be taxed at the very highest levels at nearly 100%. Right, this was back in the days when Labour governments did proper taxation. People complain about taxation now. You should have lived in the 1960s if you were on the upper end of the pay scale. And he could have lost all that for being relegated like George Brown was to the backbenches. Of course, George Brown did that as a voluntary act of self-sabotage, but Jenkins wanted to achieve things as Chancellor. And there may be other ministers in the cabinet now who are currently Foreign Secretary or Home Secretary or Health Secretary or Energy Secretary, just to pick a few random examples, who are weighing up, well, I could call for the Prime Minister to go and I could resign from the cabinet, but then what if I'm wrong? What if I make a mistake? Then I've lost my chance, possibly my only chance, to serve in cabinet at this level, doing the things that I want to achieve as a cabinet minister. Whereas for backbench MPs who are angry with Keir Starmer, as long as they have the Labour whip, and some of them do, some of them have lost it, some of them have got it back, they may feel, well, the only thing that really matters for us is our survival as an MP. And looking at these local election results, we're going to lose our constituencies. And so let's put up someone to stand against the Prime Minister. Now, the challenge is finding that person who's willing to put their name forward and stand against the Prime Minister. In 1968, Roy Jenkins bottled it. My advice to these MPs, if any of you are listening, is get the ball rolling by putting forward the name of someone who's possibly unlikely to get the 20% of nominations. But in so doing, I think that might smoke out one or two of the more recalcitrant senior MPs, and that, I think, could then lead to a leadership election.
Well, that's a much bigger theme. We'll have to park for now and see where we get to. But to wrap up this episode, I wanted to think about the longer-term consequences of major electoral upheaval, like the 1968 local elections. First of all, for the Conservative Party, this is just a slightly fun aside, but Lewis Baston did some research a few years ago on the Conservative councillors who were elected, in London in particular, in May 1968, and 15 of them went on to serve in the House of Commons. Curiously, one of them was already in the House of Commons and stood for his local council, but the remainder would become MPs in the future, including, curiously, two people who would be my members of the European Parliament when I was growing up in the Northwest, Robert Atkins and Den Dover, elected in Haringey and Barnet respectively. But also some quite big names in the future of the Conservative Party. Archie Hamilton in Kensington and Chelsea, he would be a future chairman of the 1922 committee. Peter Brook, who would be a cabinet member under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, he was elected in Camden. Sir George Young, who would at one stage be an MP in London, in Ealing and Acton, but would subsequently be an MP in Hampshire. He was elected in Lambeth and would have senior roles in the major government, certainly, but also under Cameron as well, when he was Chief Whip in government. And finally, and perhaps most famously, a young John Major was elected as a councillor in Lambeth and, of course, would go on to become Prime Minister. So for the Conservatives, this was really a way in which some quite big and notable names in the future of the party would get their first taste, not just of election, but of election victory, and would then really be encouraged, alongside other Conservatives, into the House of Commons and further up the party hierarchy. So I think for the Conservatives, this was quite an important moment, incubating future senior politicians. And I think for Labour, the consequences may have also been quite profound, if not even more dramatic. Because as we've discussed, Labour suffers a near wipeout in large parts of London, which may very well happen again in 2026. But if it does, that will presumably, and not necessarily, be permanent. It's perfectly likely that the Labour Party will, as many parties have done, rebuild after their battering at the polls. And that certainly is what happened in 1968. So the next London local elections occur in 1971. Harold Wilson is still the leader of the Labour Party. Ted Heath is still the leader of the Conservative Party. And on this occasion, Labour wins 21 of the 32 London councils. That's a gain of 18. And they elect 1,221 councillors. That's 871 gains, reversing the 1968 local elections and actually surpassing somewhat where they were in 1964. On the Conservative side, the story is flipped. So, of course, they lose 18 councils and are down to 10. That's really, again, not dissimilar from where they were at with their 9 in 1964. And they are reduced to 597 councillors, a loss of 841. So what that means really within a pretty short period of time is you have this enormous churn in terms of who is representing certainly the Labour Party in local government in London. And one of the things that can easily happen in those circumstances is that a lot of the people who lose don't stand again. Many of them will have done, and some of them will have done, but a lot of them will have said, right, well, I've been given my P45 by the voters, that's me out. And you will get a new generation with new ideas and a new perspective who take over. Richard, I wonder to what extent you think that happened in 1971 and what were the longer term consequences for Labour?
Well, it's funny you mention John Major being elected a councillor in Lambeth, because at that very same time that John Major was being elected a councillor in Lambeth, remember Lambeth, a very Labour part of London today and had normally been at that time as well, saw the wipeout of its existing councillors who'd been there in some cases for many years, working class councillors, more maybe small c conservative, traditional working class values as Labour councillors. At the same time this wipeout is happening, a young man named Ken Livingstone joins the Labour Party in Lambeth. And Livingstone says that it's one of the few recorded instances in history of a rat jumping onto a sinking ship. And he arrives and finds that the Labour Party in Lambeth is totally demoralised, that the membership is shrunken, moribund. Reminds me a little bit of where some Labour constituency Labour parties are today. And he sees this as his moment to get involved, to take, in effect, a leadership role within his constituency. And within a year, Livingstone is on the General Management Committee, the Executive Committee, the Local Government Committee. He is secretary of his constituency Labour Party. He is writing Labour's manifesto for Lambeth for the next council elections. And indeed, in 1971, in those council elections that you mentioned, Lee, Ken Livingstone gets elected a councillor in Lambeth. And he is a sort of stand-in for what then happens among Labour and local government and the Labour membership in the 1970s, where you get a lot more. I mean, Livingstone was from a working class background, but you get more middle class people of the new left, a more identitarian left, a left that's perhaps less focused on the traditional materialist Labour views, although, of course, they still do care about those, but they are diversifying the range of issues that they're interested in. And in 1973, for example, Jeremy Corbyn is elected a Labour councillor in Haringey and is part of this. And so what happens in 1968 is very interesting, because you mentioned earlier in the podcast about the left's dissatisfaction with Wilson and what did they do? And we didn't really unpack that, but there was basically a sort of debate that took place. Does the left stick with Labour and try and change Labour from within, or does the left try and seek some kind of radical alternative outside Labour? And the more, in my view, the much more successful of those were those who said, let's stick with Labour, let's change Labour, let's take over Labour, let's make Labour a much more outwardly left-wing socialist party, and let's use the Labour membership and the internal democracy of the Labour Party to put pressure on our Labour leaders so that we don't have a situation in the future where there's a Labour government that's not following our wishes, but we have a Labour government that is in effect implementing the wishes of the Labour membership. And that's very much the view that then takes over when Labour comes into government again in 1974.
So I think the lesson is, no matter how bad these local elections are for Labour, don't count Labour out for good. And look who is a part of their rebuild, because they could quite easily be the big names with the big ideas of the future. We finish each episode, as always, with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. I'll kick us off. James Heald of The Spectator recently asked on Twitter about who were the biggest names in politics who didn't have serious biographies written about them. And the person I'd be reading about isn't one of them, but it is somebody about whom there is no serious in-print biography about them. And that is Stanley Baldwin, who was Prime Minister a century ago and was 3 times Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And this week I've been reading one of those out-of-print books, which is, aptly enough, called Stanley Baldwin by G.M. Young, which came out in 1952. It is the nearest we have to an authorised biography of Stanley Baldwin. Baldwin wasn't alive when it came out, but he did speak to the author and, in fact, asked the author to write the book. It is written from a very sympathetic viewpoint. The author basically thinks that Stanley Baldwin was a person of unscrupulous moral integrity, but who was, if anything, a slightly lazy politician who therefore wasn't necessarily able to rise to the moment as demanded of him, but that he did a huge amount, which is what I happen to agree with, to keep the country together at a time when it could quite easily have fractured. It's one of the great little quirks of history that the idea of one nation conservatism is associated with Disraeli, but Disraeli wrote about the 2 nations as a critique, and it was Stanley Baldwin who would first speak about one nation and one nation conservatism, and really is probably one of the best examples of it. This is quite an interesting book in terms of what it says about how Stanley Baldwin approaches politics, about his rhetoric and the way he speaks in particular as an orator. It's not the best short. It is fairly short. It's only about 250 pages. It's not, in my view, the best short book on Stanley Baldwin. For that, you can go to Roy Jenkins' biography of him. But it is nevertheless quite a charming read about a hugely consequential Prime Minister who really deserves an in-print, full-length retelling of his life and his impact. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, this wasn't coordinated at all, but my book this week is about Stanley Baldwin's sometimes nemesis, sometimes cabinet colleague, Ramsay MacDonald. The book is The Cancelled Prime Minister, The Extraordinary Rise and Tragic Fall of Ramsay MacDonald by Walter Reed. This is a new biography of Ramsay MacDonald, who led the Labour Party from 1922 until 1931 and was a Labour Prime Minister in 1924, from 1929 to 31, and then became Prime Minister in the national government, where he shared power in cabinet with his one-time nemesis, Stanley Baldwin. And the title of the book is an allusion to the fact that MacDonald did this and became a hated figure within the Labour Party, someone who, I think if he had died in 1930, he would have been remembered warmly within the Labour Party. He wouldn't have had the status of an Attlee or even a Wilson, but he would have been someone who was well remembered in the Labour Party, not least because MacDonald really was a founder of the Labour Party and was there from the very beginning. What can I say about this book? Well, I'm all for directing more interest to Ramsay MacDonald. I think that he was a remarkable individual and that his story as someone born in very impoverished circumstances on the fringes of society in a very remote part of Scotland goes on through self-education to become the leader of the Labour Party and the first Labour Prime Minister. However, I'm not really sure why this biography was written, because it's very derivative of other biographies written on Ramsay MacDonald. The author does not seem to have done a great deal of primary research. There's very, very little that we learned from this that is new. And to be honest, I still think that the biography that David Marquand wrote about Ramsay MacDonald stands tall as the authoritative biography. And for that reason, I think I would say, if you haven't read a biography of Ramsay MacDonald yet, then I might still direct you to the Marquand biography. Nonetheless, I did enjoy reading it because I do enjoy spending time with Ramsay MacDonald, a figure who I think is extremely complex, a man who suffered a great deal in his life with the loss of his wife and his son. I think he was someone who suffered from severe depression throughout his life, someone who is not well liked in Labour law today, but I think was an essential figure in the establishment of the Labour Party, and for that reason is still worth reading about today.
We'll have links to those books in our show notes, but that's all for this episode. Just a reminder that if you enjoy listening to the podcast, we'd be delighted if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from. And that if you want to hear more, you can join our Patreon. There are bonus episodes, including a recent one on Elizabeth II's views on politics. You can also listen there ad-free to all of the episodes that we've done, including the mini-series on the Heath v Wilson elections, in which we discuss the big general elections that surrounded these 1968 local elections that we've discussed today. If we don't see you there, we'll be back on Thursday with our next Matters of Interest. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.